Welcome to the Environmental Leadership Chronicles, a podcast brought to you by the California Association of Environmental Professionals. In this episode, we're joined by Cynthia R. Harris, Director of the Institute for Environmental Sovereignty at the National Congress of American Indians. A respected leader in environmental law and tribal sovereignty, Cynthia brings deep expertise in climate adaptation, water conservation, and green infrastructure, all while advocating for tribal self-determination. Before joining NCAI, she led tribal consultation research in California as Director of Tribal Programs at the Environmental Law Institute. With experience in local government, national policy, and leadership roles at the American Bar Association and the National Academies of Sciences, Cynthia offers a unique perspective on the intersection of tribal sovereignty and environmental policy. At NCAI, the nation's oldest and largest American Indian and Alaska Native organization, she continues to advance tribal governance and environmental justice. Join us as we explore her insights on Indigenous leadership and environmental stewardship. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy. Hi, I'm Jessa, and my pronouns are she, hers.
Hi, I'm Corinne. My pronouns are she, her.
And today we have Cynthia R. Harris, who is the Director at the Institute for Environmental Sovereignty at the National Congress of American Indians. Thank you so much for joining us today, Cynthia.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So first things first, how are you connected to AEP?
Through this podcast, I appreciate learning from others in the field, especially with a focus on California. To say the least, our state is unique in many, many ways.
Yes, yes, it is. And I'm sure we'll learn more about that from you. I look forward to that. So as we get into this conversation, can you first start off with what led you to a career in the environmental profession, and what does that mean to you?
I've always had an interest in policy and always in the environment as far back as I can remember. I wish I could share a story about growing up hiking and camping in the national parks or being a teenage activist against a toxic site in my community. My idea of camping, I have to admit, is more like glamping. I'm a huge fan of indoor plumbing. And I certainly saw and read about all the ways we contaminate and devastate our neighborhoods and ecosystems. So I don't think I was significantly more exposed or aware than any of my peers growing up. So I never could understand why anyone wouldn't be environmentalist, to be honest.
Yes, I relate to that. All of that, everything you just said is very relatable. And yeah, I'm like, just who doesn't like clean air and clean water? And so can you tell us a little bit more about your career path and what led you to your current position?
Absolutely. You probably hear quite a bit that's a windy path. When I speak with folks just coming out of college or grad school, they want to know what is the way to get to, this kind of position. I have to look like there's no one way, unfortunately. I worked for a couple of nonprofits as an intern after college, nothing to do with the environment, the Asian Business Association in my city of San Diego, and then the San Diego County Taxpayers Association, both very educational. Then I ended up working for a PR agency. I was really interested at the same time. It was part of my long-term plan to get involved with local politics. So I did volunteer for a city council campaign. But when the recession was looming, all the PR, marketing, and advertising agencies were the ones that were hit first. So something like a third to a half of my firm was laid off, including me, as what last hired, first fired, I suppose. But it was a really good kick in the pants. I wanted to work in government, but thought it would take more time. But the campaign manager hired me on as a volunteer coordinator, the volunteer coordinator, which is a big job for someone in her early 20s, pretty much the next day. That was a very educational experience. It was formative for me. I learned so much about my own city and the neighborhoods and the community issues that I only had an inkling of, just actually getting down the ground, working with our volunteers, going to all these fundraisers, meeting other candidates and politicians, knocking on doors, getting a very candid, entering those candid discussions with the voters. We won by 608 votes. So we joke that 608, it's a mandate. And when my boss, Marty Emerald, was sworn in, I came on as a policy advisor in some of your listeners might remember Marty Emerald. She was a consumer advocate for many years. She called herself, she was called the troubleshooter, and we were sort of her troubleshooters working on issues and problems for the city. So I
And
love the,
Cynthia, you're
yeah.
you're also talking to two San Diego locals, so this is
Yes.
extra fun for both Jessa and myself.
Yeah, so it was a lot of fun working for her. It was a long hours, which is pretty typical, not high paying. I had a lot of responsibility. I learned a lot, to say the least. I mentioned I was a policy advisor, so I handled mostly water, wastewater, infrastructure, a bit of parks, a variety of other issues. Stormwater, of course, I will never ever escape stormwater issues throughout my career. It always comes up, and salmon later on. As a field representative, that's essentially a community liaison. I worked with specific communities in the Mid-City area, College area, El Cerrito, City Heights, which you two are probably familiar with those areas, handling everything from illegal dumping and street sweeping, just any kind of issue a constituent call with. And I will mention that a couple of issues I worked on personally was indirect potable reuse, water conservation. I was put in charge of shepherding a brand new submeetering ordinance through the whole process. I remember I was there behind my boss at city council, and they were talking, and she said, "Oh, by the way, my policy advisor Cynthia will be working on this," and I'm behind her going, "What?" So I learned very, very fast the whole process, and a lot about plumbing and buildings and water conservation. But eventually I got to a point where I felt like I'd hit a wall, which happens, I think, in a lot of people's careers. And at the same time, I'd come to know or know of many attorneys who are using their skills and their knowledge, not as litigators, which I have a lot of respect for, but zero personal interest in that part of the field. But they were working as advocates or drafting policy in a city attorney's office or elsewhere. They were mediators, they were problem solvers. So that really spurred me. Every once in a while, people in my family get bitten by an advanced degree bug. So that was me. So packed up all my stuff, or most of my stuff, and traveled across the country to New York City for law school. And unsurprisingly, I gravitated to environmental law, and I developed a real interest in federal Indian law. I was part of the environmental law clinic, which my law school, NYU, has something like 30 law clinics. So you can sort of just pick whichever one you have an affinity for. I clerked for the EPA Office of General Counsel between my second and third year, and that really spurred me to take a course on federal Indian law, because I think there were only a couple of attorneys in something like a 400 attorney office who really had a
Wow.
specialty in that. And it was part of the whole cross-cutting section, which is one reason I really like it. After law school, I was hired by the Environmental Law Institute, or ELI, and I worked on pretty much anything they told me to, from asbestos litigation to extended consumer responsibility to producer responsibility. Consumers should be responsible, of course, to forestry, Red Plus in Liberia. Didn't actually get to go to Liberia, but learned a lot, learned a lot about the history and uh, just really interesting parallels between federal Indian law here and then customary law over there. So that was pretty interesting. I eventually took on the role as director of tribal programming. There hadn't been someone, I think, in quite a while who had handled that portfolio, and still worked on water quality. I mentioned stormwater, green infrastructure, land use. I worked on projects involving indigenous food sovereignty and co-management, and government to government consultation, focusing on California. For those who are probably familiar with the CEQA process and land use planning, we have AB 52 and SB 18. And then I also hit a wall there. At the same time, I saw there was an opportunity with NCAI. I was offered that opportunity to come on board as the first director of their new Institute for Environmental Sovereignty. So I got to rub my hands together thinking about what we could do there. I will have to highlight that a big part of my quote unquote career journey is what I do outside of the work, and I am pretty involved with a number of organizations as a volunteer.
Yeah, it seems like a theme throughout is a lot of opportunities have presented themselves, whether you were voluntold or volunteered, and just kind of going with it and learning, and more just opportunities like arose out of that. And to, like you said, there's so many different nexus points between the policy and law and environmental and underrepresented communities. Um, it's it's a very unique and interesting background, and we appreciate you sharing that with us. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about was, with the Environmental Law Institute, what was your favorite project to work on, and why was that?
Goodness, there are a few projects I was very fond of for different reasons. I can give you two that are very different. I'll be quick on both of them to get two for one. And both of these were projects I was and issues I was very passionate or am very passionate about that I either brainstormed or where it was already attuned to my interest, and also involved something I have to admit that I was clueless about in one way or another, and I had to dive in and really learn from the inside out. One was a white paper on green streets policies, which was a lot of fun, a lot of work, and it ended up being something of a champagne project on a beer budget, which is kind of the story of my life. And it focused on stormwater quality, stormwater management, and green infrastructure, and a systematic approach to integrating green streets every single time you were going to dig up a street anyway, which seems like a bit of a no-brainer, but very few cities have actually implemented something like that. And it was a lot of fun learning that there was no one size fits all, just how these policies spring up organically in different communities. And then probably the last big project I worked on at ELI was on advancing tribal sovereignty in California. This was one that I was a co-PI on. I left before it was finished, but I am proud of the work I did on it. And that was focusing on government to government consultation, specifically in the state of California as a case study, because California then and probably still now is pretty much the only state that has a statutory requirement to consult with tribal nations for state agencies and for local governments. So even though there are still bugs to work out as we learned, it's still way far ahead of many states in terms of working with tribal nations. It's also pretty inspiring because the history between tribal nations and the state government going back to the 1850s is pretty horrific. And just what's the progress been made just in the past couple of decades is really inspiring.
And can you tell us a little bit more too about why you became interested in tribal and indigenous issues?
Yeah, I don't really know. I was just really drawn to it. Part of it might be a somewhat overdeveloped sense of justice, which can get me in trouble. So sort of kids don't do this at home type of thing. But at an intellectual level, it really intersects with so many other issues: civil rights, environment, wildlife, housing, climate change, which is a big issue I work on, constitutional law. You're always challenged, you're never pigeonholed, and there's just so much that needs to be done. It's just one injustice after another, but also thought that maybe I could do something working with tribal nations according to their priorities that will be helpful.
And I mean, you mentioned before the recording too that you're not a tribal citizen. And so I think it's really interesting the work that you do. And like you said, the sense of justice and trying to right wrongs as, I don't know if it'd be perceived as an outsider of the tribes, but yet doing the work on their behalf. And what's that like as far as like not being a tribal citizen, but being part of this movement?
Being very conscientious. So I think anyone working in an intertribal organization knows, as they say, if you know one tribal nation, you know one tribal nation. There are 574 just federally recognized tribal nations, and more that are either state recognized or not currently recognized. A lot of tribes have employees, including in the environmental areas and environmental and natural resource departments, who are not tribal members themselves, but they work for tribes, and it's important to be cognizant of that. Um, I will say that it's important to distinguish between environmental justice and tribal and issues of tribal sovereignty. Especially, I've met a number of people who are just coming out of college or graduate school, and they're very interested in working on tribal issues, but there's a little bit of re-education that's required because they assume they can just superimpose this framework of environmental justice on working with tribal nations. Is very different. You're working with governmental entities, with sovereign governmental entities. And that ties back into what you were asking, Jessa, that when you work for a tribal nation or for an intertribal organization, you sort of think about you're working as a government employee with any type of nation. And once you put that framework, you apply that framework, things tend to fit much better in ways you can be helpful.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that perspective.
And I think that's, supported or demonstrated by kind of the network of, maybe regulations or lack thereof that we work within for tribal development, and just a lot of the unique aspects, whether it's like the Hearth Act or how we're working within things like the Endangered Species Act, and the differences between doing so on tribal projects and elsewhere. It's really interesting and fascinating, and navigating everything, and making sure that we're able to defer to our tribal partners that have that expertise is just a really challenging part of the environmental profession.
Absolutely.
And Cynthia, you were talking, and you're talking about environmental justice. Can you explain or elaborate more on climate change adaptation and how that connects to environmental justice?
Oh, goodness, that's a good question. Tribal nations are very much on the front line of how they're impacted by tribal by climate change. My goodness, there are so many examples when you think about Alaska, where you have a number of Alaska Native villages that are quite literally moving the entire community. You think of Shishmarest, Newtok, et cetera, that are dealing with this right now. It's not something off even in the near future. When you think about Louisiana, when you think about drought, when you think about sea level rise, when you think about species migration, which is something that I think we don't discuss enough. If you have treaty reserved rights to hunt, fish, gather, and the species are quite literally moving north, what does that mean? And one reason this is really exacerbated is because so many tribal nations were removed and relocated onto what are quite frankly marginal lands. So it's that much more difficult. However, tribal nations are also among the first group to really innovate and to address these issues head on. So, like I mentioned, moving an entire community, adapting, utilizing technology, there's just a wide variety of approaches tribal nations are taking to prepare for climate change, to adapt, also to mitigate. A number of tribes, including California, have really leaned into renewable energy and uh, conservation, water being a huge issue, which is very inspiring, especially see in California when you're talking about land bases that are very small. You don't necessarily have the same opportunities that a tribe with a very large land base has for wind and solar energy, and really embodying resilience, I think, in many ways.
And I think maybe I think part of this is, can you share some insight on Indigenous knowledge and how that is related to, like, for example, cultural burning and forest management?
Absolutely. And again, I think there are a lot of examples right here in California with tribal nations like the Karuk, and then more north of where I am in San Diego, really working with the state as well and private property owners when it comes to applying cultural birding methods, which have been applied since time immemorial and very successfully so. Indigenous knowledge is specific to each tribal nation or indigenous community, so it could impact environmental decision making on in many different ways, depending on the context. Broadly, it's been very helpful in establishing environmental baselines. For example, in conducting climate change research, how much has this indicator changed over this period of time? Because we have been observing our ecosystem for centuries or longer, and we can tell you what we have seen and whether this is out of whack or not. It's also a much more holistic approach, more of an ecosystem level approach. You mentioned, Green, I believe, early Endangered Species Act and how that's more of a species by species approach. And yes, critical habitat. A member of my team, Dr. Angela Garcia Mendina, I have to give her credit for noting that this particular statute is rather outdated and we should be taking ecosystems approach. And a number of tribal nations are already doing that. So I will add that we should challenge these distinctions between, quote unquote, Western science and this entire body of knowledge and learning that I have seen treated rather condescendingly, even when it is acknowledged.
Just a couple thousand years to catch up, right? And yeah, it's very interesting to learn about all this. And like you said, the ecosystem and everything is connected in the Endangered Species Act, and these species are impacted and at risk or endangered, but then everything's connected, right? So you pull one thread and realize it's connected to everything else. And speaking of policy on that front, is what are or I should say, how are recent policy changes in California or even the US supporting or potentially hindering Indigenous land sovereignty efforts?
I mentioned that California is way ahead of other states, and I could plug a project that we're working on right now, NCI, that is actually going to find that out at a much more detailed level. We're launching something called the State Report Card Project, where we're looking at state by state, all 50 states, including Hawaii, which is very different, but we want to make sure we look at all of them, and trying to determine how well and in which way each state is advancing tribal sovereignty when it comes to the environment and natural resources. So California, I mentioned we have the consultation requirements. There has been recent legislation promoting co-management, for example, with the Natural Resources Agency. One thing that has been part of California law for a while, but I don't think is fully appreciated, is the exceptions from our open records laws when it comes to not just sacred sites, but I think it could probably extend to Indigenous knowledge as well. That's something that we've seen on the federal level where there's a gap in terms of FOIA, where it could really challenge tribal nations in working together with federal agencies if there's concern that sensitive information could be made available to everyone. But in California, we have safeguards. Again, with CEQA, you see that we allow for a confidential appendix, and then in the actual CEQA document, the environmental impact report, there'll be a redacted version. Like this is directly relevant to why we were making this decision, but it's based on a much longer conversation, which we discussed with the tribal nation that could be impacted by this particular project. And that is something I think only one other state has as well, though it can be a bit piecemeal. And climate change as well. I've seen more discussion about local and state governments working with tribal nations when it comes to climate change, adaptation, resiliency, and again, coming back to cultural burning, where tribal nations could work with local and state government agencies and coordinating that.
Yeah, so I'm making some notes as you're saying all this. I'm like, this is so interesting to learn about. And I apologize if I missed this, but what's the timing for the state report? Am I saying this wrong? Oh my gosh, the state report card project.
Yeah, just like school, right? Where you're graded. It will probably take another year and a half or so. This is going to be very extensive. We will make sure that we're doing it right. We've spoken with other organizations that have done report card type projects like this, and they say that sounds about right to them. So at least we're under the middle part of the bell curve, at least as far as that goes.
Cool. Look forward to that. That's exciting. And sorry, I'm trying to think of like there's so many different directions to go with all the work you do and all the knowledge you have. And so I think one of the questions I wanted to ask is how can environmental planners and professionals, which is a lot of our audience, uphold free, prior, and informed consent in decisions about native land, past or present?
FPIC?
Yes.
Yes, I would say that the answer, you're going to laugh at this, it's in the term itself, not making decisions that could impact tribal nations and indigenous people if you don't engage with them early on in concept development, get their input and incorporate it and obtain freely given consent. A number of indigenous communities and tribal nations are fairly used to whether it's state agencies, local agencies, federal agencies coming in where the project is already pretty much baked and you're just changing things around the margins. And that is not even at the consultation level. And I think it's pretty straightforward, but at least in theory, it's pretty straightforward. In practice, that's something very, very different.
And maybe getting into the details of practice a little bit. And I work in renewable energy and do a lot of work, with tribal partners on tribal land. And one of the things that we try to balance is how to do that early, often engagement or small c consultation, because we obviously are not a government agency and can't engage in government to government consultation. But we also understand that resources are tight, and it's a different role to play as an applicant or a project sponsor than a government entity. And just both selfishly and for our listeners who are maybe in a similar position, do you have any advice or suggestions for how we can be respectful of tribal resource and tribal time, but also still get that early input on projects, especially non-government sponsored projects?
That's a good question. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about resources being tight. There's a lot of work and advice out there talking more about the theoretical concept of consultation, what it means to be meaningful. But when we were talking to tribal employees, whether they were tribal historic preservation officers or environmental directors or just anyone involved, as well as on the consultant and state side, we asked them, what are the sticking points? What's sort of we're talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly of consultation estate. And what came up over and over again were really the pragmatic issues. A number of tribal nations said, look, we get literally 400 consultation requests every year, and it's just the paperwork. There's at least one tribe that's created its own web portal for people to put in requests and to streamline things. So being cognizant of that, making it as easy as possible, it can be difficult if I can only imagine based on what I've heard, is just picking through these different requests and essentially triaging, making sure that tribal nations have the resources. Now, as you mentioned, as a consultant or as the project developer, the applicant is very different. And the relationship is between the government of the tribal nation and the state or federal agency. It's more on the side of the state or the federal government to facilitate that. It would be great if every proposed project, the planning process incorporated into the budget funding for tribes to really participate at that level. One thing that I would highlight, I'm sorry, I can't give you a straightforward answer, like this is the silver bullet, but recognizing that tribal nations are experts in their own culture. Again, that might seem like a no-brainer, but I've seen a number of times where the representative from the tribe is saying, look, this entire area is important because of X, Y, and Z, culturally, historically, in terms of religion. And then you have an outside archaeologists coming and said, well, actually, these are distinct sites. So all we need to do is we need to, move these off here, cordon this off here, and cordon off there, and then we could just bulldoze the rest of this and it'll be fine. And it takes a lot of chutzpah to say that I know more about the history and culture of the tribe than the person who is the actual head of the cultural resources department at the tribe. And I can only imagine how frustrating it is because a number of these folks do have their PhDs or masters because they feel like, I have to prove myself on the terms of, from a Western perspective. So I have gone through all the training and picking up of knowledge through this traditional way. And I have gone to many, many years of grad school and I'm still being treated as lesser than. And it is enormously frustrating just based on conversations I've had.
Yeah. Very, very well put. And, there's a lot of examples like that. I think of experts or, people coming in with good intentions, but the reality is learning from the local community, whatever that community is, and coming in and doing this type of early engagement, rather than telling the community what they need and why it's important. So I think that's a really good point and a really important lesson for any professional to be aware of when they're working with, um, when they're coming into communities that they aren't part of.
Very true.
And as far as the future goes, what trends do you see shaping environmental sovereignty and indigenous land rights?
I think there's so many. It's very promising and on the global level, not just in the United States. I'm fortunate that I get to see what's going on elsewhere. I'd say rights of nature. I know that's very much in the zeitgeist right now, but it's really interesting to see it also from the perspective of tribal nations that are adopting their own recognition of rights of nature, either through their constitution or resolution or ordinance. Indigenous protected and conserved areas, which you see more in other parts of the world. I believe there are at least a couple in Canada right now. Land back. I have to give credit to Professor Lauren Van Schiffgaard, a law professor at UCLA, who's also a tribal citizen. When there was a workshop that I was part of, and a federal employee asked her what the government could do to promote tribal sovereignty and just pretty much help, I would say, she responded, well, you could always just give the land back and just sort of let that sit there for a while. So I thought that was very well put. Technology. Tribal nations are utilizing drone technology, artificial intelligence, satellite technologies, not just as adopters, but as innovators. And I don't think that's recognized sufficiently. And yes, just going from there, there's quite a lot that's underway, and I'm excited to see where things go.
That's great. I love to hear the optimism and the hope. And like you said, all the stuff that you shared that is happening, that might not be getting as much attention and awareness. And so being able to come here and share that, and maybe that's something we could speak about in a future episode. That would be really cool to learn about, from you or your peers. So thank you for sharing that with us.
My pleasure.
And I mean, we could get into the wrap up rapid five. You've shared a lot. I've learned a lot personally. Hopefully, I think the same for our listeners. But before we move on, I want to see, Corinne, if there's anything we didn't get to that you have on your mind.
No, I think this has been a super fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate your time, Cynthia, and joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Okay, Cynthia, for the wrap up rapid five, these are the hardest hitting questions for the whole thing. What
I
what
am
is your
ready.
favorite what is your favorite daily habit?
I'd say, believe it or not, my morning workout, and that's mostly because I'm a very cranky and unpleasant person to be around until I've had my workout and a good breakfast.
As we're speaking to you in the morning, we appreciate that habit. What are 3 things you'd bring to a deserted island?
I've heard on prior podcasts people give very pragmatic responses to this, and mine are completely fluff. Books, chocolate, and a cat.
Love it. What is your favorite environmental policy?
At the moment, Rights of Nature, which I mentioned before, it's a legal fiction I can actually get behind, and it's not human focused, but humans certainly benefit from it.
And what is your favorite flora or fauna?
That's an easy one. Theobroma cacao.
I might have to Google that. What is
My
it?
favorite food, chocolate.
Chocolate. I heard the cacao at the end and I'm like, I think that's chocolate, but I was like, it's going to be chocolate or a cat. And then finish this sentence. Wouldn't it be cool if?
I can think of a few different things. I think it would be cool if nature had lobbyists, high-powered lobbyists. I think it would be cool if instead of a Bureau of Indian Affairs, we have a department and account level secretary of Indian Affairs to really elevate that. Yeah, I think those would be 2 things that'd be very neat to happen.
Me too. Thank you so much, Cynthia. We appreciate you joining us.
And I appreciate you having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to be updated when new episodes are released and leave us a review to let us know what you think. It also really helps us to share the podcast with others who may enjoy learning about the environmental industry. If you want to submit a shout out or any feedback, please send an email or voice memo to podcast@califaep.org. The email again is podcast with an S, podcast@califaep.org.